All right, in the first part of this lesson, we got all of the functionality up and running inside our Click the Clown game, including the ability to have a clown character bouncing around a room and the ability to click on that clown and have it reappear in a different location inside the room at a random location. That's the functionality. Now let's turn it into an actual game. The goals for the game are going to be to get as many points as possible within a limited amount of time. In order to be able to accumulate points, you click on the clown. That will give you points. The points that you are getting will be shown on the screen, and we will create a timer that counts down to 0, at which point the game will be over. All right, so let's go back into our clown project and get into our workspace. And let's see what we've got going here. All right, so we're going to create a new object. And in fact, it's kind of a new kind of object. Up until this point, when we have created objects, they have been objects that have appeared inside our room through the use of sprites. But there's another kind of game object, which is one that has no visible component. Instead, it's simply an object that we can use behind the scenes in order to manage different interactions and events that are taking place in our game. So let's create one of those kind of objects, and we'll call it obj underscore game controller. Okay. There'll be no sprite that goes with it. But what we'll do with it is we're going to use this one for one thing to include the ability to draw some GUI elements on the screen. So let's see. How are we going to do that? Well, we'll create a draw event, which we will use to draw something onto the screen. We could choose draw or draw GUI. We'll play around with these two different types, but for now we'll just say draw. And what do we want to draw? Well, first of all, we're going to draw some text on the screen that's going to tell the player how many points they have at the moment. And built into GameMaker are a vast collection of built-in draw functions that all start with the word draw, followed by an underscore. And you can see when I type it in, we have autocomplete to a whole pile of these things. One of which is to set the color of the text that we want to draw on the screen. And there are some built-in colors as well that all start with the letter C and an underscore. And in our case, let's say we'll create white color. So we're going to start off by defining the color for some text that we want to show onto the screen. That's fine. What is the text that we want to show on the screen? Well, we're going to use draw again. And what we're going to draw is some text. And then in order to draw the text, we need to tell GameMaker where we want the text to appear using the X and Y coordinates associated with the object that we are attaching this draw action to, given that we're using the boy. We need to tell GameMaker where we want to draw the text using X and Y coordinates. So you can put whatever you like in. I'm going to put 100 pixels for the X and 100 pixels for the Y. Then I have to tell what it is I want to draw, what I want the text to say. And in order to do that, we need to pass this draw text function a string. And a string is just a set of characters that is enclosed in quotes. So let's say I'm going to want to show the word score. There's a string, score colon, and then a space. But I want to combine that string with the player's actual score. And there's a yet another built-in variable inside GameMaker that is in fact called score. So if I type in the word score, you'll see here's that built-in variable. And if I want to show both this string that says score and I want to show the value of score, there are a couple of special things I need to do. First, I'm going to use a plus symbol. And if you've not used programming before, the idea of this plus symbol when we're working with strings is that I can take one string and I can combine that string with another string using plus. But this won't quite work. And the reason it won't quite work yet is that this is a string, this thing enclosed in quotes, but this is actually a number. And GameMaker will get confused, basically. Well, why are you trying to show a string but also trying to show a number? And it won't really know what to do with that. So we need to tell GameMaker, hey, this score, we know it's a number, but we want you to display it as a string. And I can do that using yet another built-in function in GameMaker, which is called string. And we pass information to that function of the number that we want to display as a string. And let me close the whole thing off with another parentheses. There we go. Pretty. Now, right now you may be thinking, well, wait a minute. Is there a score? As far as I know, there is no score inside this game yet. And if that's what you're thinking, you are right. It's because we haven't yet set a score anywhere. Well, one place we can do it is here on the clown object in our left pressed event. Let's say we're going to take whatever their score is currently, and we're going to add to it the old value of score, right? Plus, well, let's say, let's just change this around a little. We're going to say we want this player score to be equal to whatever the old value of score was, plus 100. I get 100 points. Right. Now there are other ways to say this same thing. We can say that we want the current score to be equal to whatever the old score was plus 100, which is what we said here. Another way to write it is to say this, score plus equals 100. It's just shorthand for saying score equals score plus 100. Now, it's a little confusing because we still have never really set an initial value for score, so it's going to be nothing, essentially. And if we're telling our game controller that we want to display the text for whatever the current value of score is, well, initially there will be no value, so it'll just say score. Will this work yet? Not quite. Do you know why? Well, we have to add this controller object to our room. So I'll drag it out and put it wherever I want. I'll just stick it up here in the corner. Now, assuming we did everything right, when we start the game, you'll see now it says score. Oh, it says 0, so it automatically sets it to 0. I click it, and it's now 100, 200, 300. So that's nice, actually, instead of just having the value be nothing, which could possibly give us an error when we say to the clown object on click, we want to add 100 points to whatever the current value is. It initializes it to 0 if we haven't explicitly set it to some other value somewhere else. Well, that's nice. Well, that's good. Now let's create a timer on screen that will count down from 60 seconds down to 0, and the player will have then 60 seconds in order to get as many points as they can before the game ends. There are a lot of different ways to create timers, and so I'm going to show you first one way, and then as we go along, I'll likely show you some other ways as well. This first way we're going to use is going to make use of the fact that GameMaker operates in a certain number of steps per second. Now in class I mentioned that by default it's 30 steps per second. And you can actually specify if you want it to be some other number of steps per second, or another way of saying it is frames per second. We'll go with the default, which is 30 at the moment. If we know how many frames there are per second, we can calculate how many frames happen in a second and then use that information to count how many seconds have passed. Say what? Well, let me show you how we can do that. So let's go back into our controller object, and we're going to add something here. We're going to do a create event, and in this create event, we are going to declare and initialize our own variable. Now, before this, we've been using all built-in variables in GameMaker. We've used hspeed and vspeed and direction and so on. But when you're actually getting farther along in developing games in GameMaker, I think what you will find, and in fact what I encourage, is that you start to move away from the built-in variables and instead start to create your own variables. And these variables, for those folks who haven't done programming, are basically named containers for stuff that you want to store in memory. Right? So we're going to create our own variable called step count. Right? And we're going to initialize it, or in other words, give it a initial value of 0. Good. Now I mentioned that before this we've been using built-in variables, and now we're creating our own variable. What kind of variable is this one exactly? This one that we've just created is something that's called an instance variable. What does that mean? Well, it means that this variable lives on an instance of a game object. And it can have different values on different instances or different copies of a given object. So that if we had like 20 clowns out in our scene, it's possible that depending on how we set things up, each of those copies of that clown might have a different value associated with this step count variable, and each copy would keep track of its own copy of the variable. Okay, so we've created that one. That's good enough. We're going to make use of that step count as follows. Up till now, we had this create event, which happens only one time, right when an object's first, or an instance of an object first appears in a room. We've also used this draw event, and the draw event is actually something that happens over and over and over and over again every frame that your game is playing, or every step. It's drawing and redrawing and redrawing and redrawing. We're going to make use of another kind of event that acts in a similar way to the draw event, which is called a step event. And there are different types of step events, but we'll just do the default one now, which is called step. And like the draw event, this is one that's going to repeatedly happen every step that your game is running. And what we want to do, we're going to make use of the fact that our game is running at 30 steps per second. So we're going to say we want to update step count and have it be equal to whatever the old value of step count was, plus 1. And this is going to happen over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So after 30 steps, our step count will have gone up to 30, and because our program is set to do 30 steps per second, we can use that information to figure out a number of seconds that have elapsed. Okay? All right. Let's go back now, close that guy off, and we're going to go into our draw event again. And inside our draw event, we're going to create yet another custom variable, but this time we're going to create it yet a third type. We've had our built-in variables, we've had instance custom variables, and now we're going to create a variable that is called a local variable. And a local variable is one that lives only within this script that we're writing. And as soon as the script finishes running, the value of this local variable will just poof, it'll vanish. It doesn't have any permanence like our instance variable does. Right? We're going to create a local variable that we'll call seconds. And we are going to set this local variable equal to, now we're going to get a little bit of math, floor step count divided by room speed. So what in the heck does that mean? Well, floor, if you're not sure what something means, by the way, you can middle click on a word if it's a built-in function, and it will tell you what it means. Floor returns a given number rounded down to the nearest integer. Okay? So we're going to divide step count by the speed of the room and then round that result down to the nearest whole number. And that will then be stored in this local variable called seconds, which tells us how many seconds have elapsed. Now we want to count down, and we can do that by creating yet another local variable that I'm going to call countdown. And I'm going to set it equal to whatever we want our maximum time to be. In our case, we'll say 60, minus whatever the value of seconds is. Once we've got all that in place, now we want to display on our GUI the value of what the current number of seconds remaining is. So we can make use of, in fact, copy this draw text here and just modify it a bit. So again, we'll use draw text. We're going to position the y coordinate down a little bit by making this number larger, removing down the screen from the top of the room toward the bottom by 20 pixels compared to this one. We're going to show the amount of time, so we'll show the string time, and instead of showing score, we'll show countdown. Assuming all that works, we should now see our countdown on the screen. There it is. Well, that's all excellent, but we're not quite done yet, right? What will happen currently if that timer reaches 0? Well, nothing. In fact, it will continue to count down into negative numbers. So to end the game, we need to do a little bit more. And we need to know if the state of the game changes from sort of regular gameplay into an ending state. And our ending state means when that counter reaches 0. That's a common thing when you're building video games, to create a series of game states for the overall game itself, and you may also create a collection of states for characters in the game, like your enemies might have a patrolling state, an alert state, an attacking state, a running away state, and so on. So a game state is basically a kind of meta state for the game that describes what's happening in the game at a given moment. So let's create our own states for our game. To do that, let's go back into our create event on our controller object. And here in the create event is a place where you'll often set up a collection of variables, your own custom variables. And in fact, we already created one here called step count. Now, we didn't explicitly initialize a value for our game time. I'm going to do that now, and I'm going to call it 60. It's better to do this rather than have a kind of magic number, that's 60, that we saw earlier here inside our draw. We're going to get rid of this, and instead we'll call it game time. Just it makes more sense, right? And let's also create a game state variable, and we'll set the game state equal to 0. And there are a lot of different ways that we can do this. Rather than setting it to a number, you can give it a name. You can use enums, which we'll get into way later in class. But for now, we're just going to give it a number. So initially, our game will be set into state 0. Excellent. All right, let's go back into our draw event. So as I said, we instead of having that 60, we're going to say game time. Right? And what else do we want to do? Let's see. Well, we need to make some changes to the step event. And the changes we're going to make are going to be to determine how many seconds we have left and to determine if the timer has reached 0. Okay? So first, what we'll do is we'll say, let's set seconds equal to floor. This is going to look familiar, right? Floor step count divided by room speed. And you might be saying, wait a minute, didn't you just do this somewhere else? Well, as a matter of fact, we did. We've got it here in the draw event, right? But here we've got it as a local variable, and here we've got it as a instance variable. And I want to show you that these two are sort of separate from each other. Okay. Then what? Well, let's check to see if we have reached the end of our time. So I'll type this out and then I'll explain what I'm doing. Before I go on, I want to make one more change. So I mentioned that here in the step event, I'm now saying seconds equals floor, step count, and this is what we did earlier, right? Over here in the draw event. It seems kind of silly, right? To do it here and to do it here. And so what we can do is we can actually get rid of this completely. And because here in the step event, we are using a variable called seconds that is not a local variable, right? It's an instance variable. And what that means is that this one can be used anywhere in any script that's associated with this object. So something I do here, over here, it will be able to see it and make use of it also. Okay, so that's a start. The other new thing that is going on here is that I've added in an if statement. And what in the world is an if statement? Well, an if statement allows you to react to changes in the program and then branch what happens in the program based on the logic in an if. So basically it means you ask a yes or no question about some value that's in your game. And if the answer is true, then you do one thing. And if the answer is false, then you do something else. So here's how this works in practice. So right here, we've written an if statement that's got something kind of fancy going on. Let's look just at this first part. We say if game time minus seconds is less than or equal to 0. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, game time, if you remember, we set to 60 initially. And seconds we're calculating, right? So the longer the game goes on, the smaller this value will be. So it starts off with 60, and then 59, 58, 57, blah, 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 blah. Eventually it'll reach 0. And when it reaches 0, this becomes true. If this minus this is less than 0, well, yeah, okay, that's true. And if it's true, what we want GameMaker to do is to do whatever actions are written here inside these parentheses. To make things extra complicated, though, we're going to add one more thing. We have these two symbols here, which essentially means and. Game state is equal to 0. So when we started our program, we set the game state to 0. What's happening here is we want to know a couple of things. We want to know if there's no more time left, meaning that this value is less than 0, we want to do this. But also, we want to make sure if this is 0 and also the game state is 0, which means we're in sort of the regular game mode. If both of these things is true, and only if both of these things is true, then do this stuff in here. That's what all of this crazy typing means. So let's assume we've run out of time and we're in the regular game state 0. In that case, set game state equal to -1. This could be any value. We're just picking numbers essentially, and we're sort of making our own decision that game state 0 means regular old game, and game state -1 means the game is over. So we're saying, all right, time's up. We're going to switch from regular gameplay to the game is over. And we're going to set an alarm. I'm going to leave this alone for a second because we're not going to play with it yet. And by putting these 2 forward slashes, I can comment this out, meaning it's still there, but GameMaker will ignore it for the time being.